Okay, welcome back. Last week we discussed social learning theory, and today we're going to be discussing labeling theory, which I would say is one of the more distinctive theories that we encounter in criminology. I would use the word distinctive more so because labeling theory is just kind of different from other criminological theories that are used to explain crime. When we typically think about why someone commits crime, we ask things like, why was the individual delinquent in the first place? Did they have some sort of strain on their lives? Did they just lack self-control and they lashed out? Or was it something that they were learning from their peers? Perhaps a lack of social bonds? Well, labeling theory, to be honest, doesn't care about any of these things. It really shifts our attention away from a lot of these more conventional explanations of crime, and instead asks us to examine what happens after a person commits crime, right? And this is one of the limitations of labeling theory. It's really shifting our attention away from the initial act of deviance in question, and is looking at what happens after somebody gets caught. What happens when the police arrest them? What happens when a court convicts them? What happens when teachers, parents, employers, etc. just start calling you a criminal, a delinquent, a hoodlum, a troublemaker, etc. But more importantly, the real question we're asking here is, can these societal reactions actually affect the likelihood that a person continues to offend? That's really the central question I'd like you to keep in mind as I continue throughout this lecture. What happens after society defines someone as a deviant? And the argument that we're going to be exploring is a little bit counterintuitive because labeling theory suggests that sometimes when we go out of our way to try to control deviance or curb crime, labeling theory is really saying, hey, some of these things can actually unintentionally contribute to more deviance. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that punishment always causes crime, and it also doesn't mean that everybody who gets arrested suddenly becomes a lifelong offender who's always going to revert to recidivism, because we're going to see later on in my lecture that empirical evidence is far more conditional than that. But labeling theory is really saying you need to consider the possibility that social control itself can become a part of the causal process that we're trying to explain. And that's again why this theory is so distinctive, as I said earlier. So let's begin by defining just what labeling theory is. So like I mentioned earlier, labeling theory shifts our attention away from the initial act of deviance and crime and really focuses on society's reaction to that act. So the distinction here, like I said before, it's very important. Now, labeling theorists would generally not try to provide a comprehensive explanation for why somebody commits their very first deviant act. Edwin Lemert is going to become especially important for understanding that distinction when we discuss primary and secondary deviance. So instead, labeling theory is particularly interested in explaining why deviance might continue after the initial act, why deviance would start to escalate or become incorporated into someone's identity following a social reaction. So to give you an example, let's say we have two different teenagers that are engaging in similar misconduct. Maybe both of them are shoplifting in this case. So let's say one of them gets caught and they're formally processed through the juvenile justice system. They get suspended from school, and let's say that over their life course, it starts to develop a reputation amongst teachers and parents that this teenager is nothing more than a delinquent. And let's say that the other teenager who was shoplifting never got caught, and he never experienced any of these same consequences. Well, the initial behavior might have been very similar between these two different people, but their experiences afterwards now, of course, have become very different. And that's where labeling theory becomes interested. So a label can be formal, an arrest, a conviction, incarceration, or juvenile justice intervention that can officially communicate that somebody occupies a deviant status. But the labels, they don't have to be formal, they can be also informal in nature. So parents can treat somebody as a troublemaker, teachers can begin expecting misconduct, peers can view somebody differently, employers can also reject someone because of their criminal history. So labeling theorists argue that these reactions potentially matter because they can affect both how people treat you and eventually how you understand yourself. So that's the first part. The second part is also very important here. A label doesn't necessarily have to remain something external to a person, and under different circumstances, it can actually become incorporated into an individual's self-concept. So you can kind of start to see the potential process unfolding here, right? You have someone engaging in deviance, society reacts to that deviance, and then a label is applied to that person. And the label changes social interactions and potentially the person's self-concept of themselves. And these consequences can start to contribute to further deviance. Lemert and Becker are foundational scholars here, but as we'll see, contemporary labeling research has gone substantially beyond simply just stating that if you call somebody a criminal, they're going to become a criminal. More of the modern research is identifying a lot more of the specific mechanisms involving things like stigma, peer networks, education, employment, anticipated rejection, and cumulative disadvantage that factor into these things. So if If you remember just one distinction from this slide, I would implore you to remember this. Labeling theory is primarily concerned with what happens after the initial deviance occurs. And to understand where this idea came from, I'm going to be jumping back into before Lemert and Becker, and we're going to look at the actual intellectual foundations of labeling theory. One thing that's important to understand historically is that labeling theory doesn't really have a single founder. Sometimes we get into the habit of associating different criminological theories with one person in particular. Think of, say, social learning theory with Ron Akers, or general strain theory with Agnew, differential association of Sutherland. Well, labeling theory definitely developed a little bit differently as it emerged gradually from a symbolic interactionist tradition, and several scholars contributed pieces of what eventually became the labeling perspective. So I created a timeline that you can see here on this slide that gives us the major progression that we're going to be following, and don't worry, I will be getting into all of these individually. So Cooley, of course, gave us the important theory of identity. How we understand ourselves is going to be influenced partly by how we believe other people see and evaluate us. Then we moved to Frank Tannenbaum in 1938 and what he called the dramatization of evil, and Tannenbaum really brought these ideas much more directly into the study of delinquency and started to examine what happens when society takes misconduct and increasingly defines an individual themselves as deviant. And then we moved to Lemert in 1951, who gives us enormously important distinction between primary and secondary deviance. I'll be talking about that later. And then lastly, Howard Becker's Outsiders in 1963, which just really consolidates the societal reaction perspective, which Becker emphasized that deviance isn't just simply an inherent quality of behavior, because you have to have rules that are created, enforced, and applied to certain people. So you can see there's clearly an intellectual progression that occurs here. And also I wanted to just mention Barmachi's historical analysis, because I think it's useful and reminds us not to oversimplify this history and say things like, oh, Tannenbaum invented labeling theory in 1938. These ideas actually grew out of the broader symbolic interactionist and Chicago school intellectual traditions. You can notice the bigger transformation that's happening across these scholars. Traditional criminologists have always been asking, why did this person commit crime? But once again, the labeling theorist's perspective is asking, what happens when society reacts to that person as deviant? So you can see the major change in the object of explanation here. And the offender is no longer the only thing that we're studying. We're also studying the people, institutions that are doing the reacting to the person: police, courts, schools, family, employers, communities, and other agents of social control. And so eventually this does produce a very provocative question. Could society's reaction to crime sometimes contribute to the continuation of crime? And this is where we're headed. So now we're moving into Cooley's work, and his contribution is important because he gives us an intellectual foundation for understanding how a social interaction contributes to the development of the self. And his famous concept is the looking glass self, as I mentioned earlier. So the basic idea here is that we don't construct our identities entirely in isolation. Our understanding of ourselves doesn't happen in a vacuum. It develops partly through interaction with other people and through how our perceptions of those people see us. So there are three basic steps shown here that I've detailed on this slide. And first, we have to imagine how we appear to other people. Second, we imagine how those other people evaluate us. And third, those perceived evaluations can influence how we understand ourselves. So think about the phrase looking glass. It's essentially a mirror. And instead of looking into a physical mirror to see ourselves, we're metaphorically looking at ourselves through what we believe to be the eyes of other people. And that becomes extremely important as far as labeling theory is concerned, because imagine if somebody is repeatedly receiving the message that they're intelligent, responsible, trustworthy, and capable. Well, those social evaluations can potentially become incorporated into that person's understanding of themselves. But if we were to consider the opposite, let's say somebody is repeatedly told that they're a delinquent or a criminal, they're untrustworthy, and teachers expect trouble from them, the police recognize them as an offender, your employer doesn't trust you, or even just other members of your community begin treating you differently. Well, from a symbolic interactionist perspective, those judgments are, they're not socially meaningless. That's going to wear down on you, right? These potentially become information that the person uses in constructing their own identity. And I want to be careful here because Cooley wasn't giving us the complete modern criminological theory of labeling theory that we're discussing today. We're more so tracing its intellectual foundation, and that's the point here. So labeling theorists eventually do is they take this basic insight about identity and social interaction, and then they started to ask, what happens when social judgment being reflected back at somebody is deviant or criminal? And that's the bridge from Cooley to the later labeling theorists. Okay, so now we're moving into Tannenbaum, and his work is where these ideas become much more directly connected to crime and delinquency. So his important concept is the dramatization of evil that I talked about earlier. So despite this more dramatic name, the underlying argument here is actually fairly intuitive. So Tannenbaum was interested in what happens when society reacts to youthful misconduct in a way that increasingly transforms the misconduct into a defining characteristic of a person. So if you look at my slide here, you can start to see the sequence. If we start with misconduct, then you have a societal reaction to the misconduct, and then that reaction involves tagging and defining the individual, and then the individual might become increasingly separated or segregated from other conventional people. So the idea here is the eventuality, you're going to have a deviant identity that's going to become more salient. And the crucial change here is essentially the difference between saying you did something bad and saying that you are bad, right? So these are not the same social message. The first is condemning an action. You did something bad. But the second starts to define the person. You are bad, right? And once this individual becomes the object of this condemnation, Tannenbaum's whole argument here becomes much more consequential. Other people might begin interpreting that person's future behavior due to the label. It's owed in part to that label. And the individual might be excluded from conventional relationships. They might increasingly interact with others who have similarly deviant identities, and the label can become more central to how the person is socially understood. And this gives us one of the greatest paradoxes that runs through labeling theory. Any attempts to control deviance may sometimes help intensify it. So imagine a person who commits a relatively minor misconduct. If the response to his behavior, his or her behavior, increasingly segregates that person, and they repeatedly define them as a delinquent and then reorganizes their whole social identity around that deviance, then the intervention designed to control that original misconduct might unintentionally help make deviance more enduring as a result. And again, we need to avoid turning this into a deterministic argument. Tannenbaum isn't giving us a rule that says every person who receives a negative label inevitably becomes a persistent criminal. That's not what Tannenbaum is saying. The important theoretical insight from his work is that the social reaction itself can have consequences. And that's a massive development because now the reaction to crime is no longer merely the response to the thing that we're trying to explain. The reaction can potentially become a part of the explanation itself. And the idea actually sets us up perfectly for Lemert's work because Lemert is going to formalize this distinction much more and more so clearly through the concepts of both primary and secondary deviance that I'll get into. Okay, so with Lemert, I would say this is probably one of the more important slides in the entire lecture because Lemert just gives us the distinction between both primary and secondary deviance. So if you're trying to understand labeling theory, you really need to understand this distinction. So let's start off with primary deviance. Primary deviance refers essentially to the initial rule violation. So say somebody commits some sort of deviant behavior, but that behavior doesn't necessarily become central to their identity. And here's something that's really important about labeling theory. Labeling theory generally doesn't attempt to explain where that initial deviance came from, right? That's one of the limitations of labeling theory. So maybe somebody commits a crime because of strain. Maybe they learned the behavior from delinquent peers. Maybe some other criminological theory explains it, but that's not really Lemert's primary concern. His question is, what happens after the initial deviance occurs? And that's where we get to the middle part of this diagram here, that being social reaction. So other people respond to the behavior. The individual might experience labeling, stigma, rejection, or differential treatment. And under certain circumstances, that process can lead to what Lemert calls secondary deviance. So secondary deviance occurs when the social reaction to the initial behavior becomes increasingly consequential for the individual's identity and subsequent subsequent behavior. So think about the distinction this way. With primary deviance, let's say I committed a deviant act. But with secondary deviance, we're potentially moving toward deviance has become a part of who I am and how other people understand me to be. So that's a far more consequential process, as you can see here. And this is why labeling theory is so different from many other criminological theories. The reaction to the original behavior can become part of the causal explanation for the behavior that follows. So, in other words, initial deviance, social reaction, secondary deviance. So, now, that doesn't mean social reaction automatically produces secondary deviance. We're going to discuss that qualification repeatedly throughout this lecture, but Lemert gives us labeling theory's one of its central propositions that society's reaction to deviance itself might contribute to the continuation and persistence of deviant behavior, and that distinction between primary and secondary deviance becomes absolutely foundational to everything we're going to discuss from this point forward. Okay, so now we're getting into Becker's 1963 work, Outsiders. So Howard Becker published this in 1963, and this was just another foundational work in labeling theory. And he was asking us to reconsider something that might have seemed more intuitive or just obvious, and that question is, what actually makes something deviant? Now, you might intuitively think, well, hey, something's going to be deviant, Shane, if the behavior is deviant. And again, that's a little bit circular reasoning, but Becker is more so complicating this assumption, and he argues that social groups will create rules, and they're going to define particular behaviors as violations of those rules, and then apply those rules and labels to particular people. So that's why on my slide here I have us beginning with rule creation. So if you have a rule creation, naturally you're going to have rule violations, and society will react to those rule violations and then apply labels. And ultimately, a person can actually acquire what Becker describes as an outsider status. So the whole insight here is that deviance is not simply an inherent characteristic of an act. Deviance is also produced through social definition and social reaction. So think about what this means. Committing a particular behavior and becoming socially recognized as a deviant are not necessarily identical processes, and the social response matters. Rules have to be created, rules also have to be enforced, and people have to be identified as violators, and labels do have to be applied. So this also helps us to understand why labeling theory becomes interested in the agents of social control, because we're no longer examining only the person who broke the rules, we're also looking at the people and institutions who are defining these people and slapping on these different labels. So that can of course include things like the police, different law enforcement institutions, the courts, schools, families, different communities, and other institutions. So Becker actually helps shift criminology toward an examination of societal reaction itself. And so when we combine works like Becker and Lemert, the theoretical argument becomes far more clear, and Lemert tells us that secondary deviance can emerge following social reaction, and now Becker is helping us to understand that the social process through which particular behaviors and individuals start to become defined through and are treated as a deviant in the first place. So when we combine the works of Becker and Lemert, together these ideas are really helping us establish some of the foundation for contemporary labeling theory. Okay, so this is the part in the lecture where we're moving from classical to contemporary labeling theory. You could say that it's becoming more empirically sophisticated, if you will. So the early theorists gave us the central proposition that social reactions can definitely alter identities and potentially contribute to secondary deviance, but contemporary criminology needs something more specific than this, and if I were to tell you that labeling theory increases subsequent offending, the obvious question should be, well, Shane, how is this possible? Also, what is the actual mechanism connecting the label to the later behavior? And contemporary labeling research has identified several possible pathways here. So the first is identity. This is the closest classical version of labeling theory. A person might increasingly develop a deviant self-concept, and the label can contribute to secondary deviance. But identity isn't the only mechanism. The second pathway involves social relationships. Official intervention might alter someone's peer networks. An individual individuals might become increasingly associated with more delinquent peers or embedded within criminal social groups. And we're going to see very good longitudinal evidence for this when we're discussing the works of Bernburg, Krohn, and Rivera. And the third pathway involves opportunities. Official intervention can affect things like education, employment, and other forms of conventional social integration. So the label may matter not simply because someone starts thinking I'm a criminal, but because the person's actual life opportunities have changed because of the label. And lastly, we have stigma. So an individual can experience rejection, discrimination, devaluation, and even the anticipation that other people are going to reject them because of their stigmatized status. So modern labeling theory becomes considerably richer than just simplistic idea that someone called me a criminal, therefore I became a criminal. Instead, we're actually talking about multiple potential mechanisms that are all factoring in together. An identity transformation, stigma and rejection, criminal embeddedness, blocked opportunities, and cumulative disadvantage. So importantly, these mechanisms are empirically testable too, which is great. And researchers like Paternoster, Iovani, Link and colleagues, Bernburg, Krohn, Lopes, and many others have actually allowed us to examine whether or not these processes can actually occur. So when we're moving from a broad theoretical proposition towards a much more specific causal question, and that question being, through what mechanisms does official intervention contribute to continued offending? And that's really where contemporary labeling theory becomes particularly useful. So when we put all these different pieces together, the next slide essentially is going to walk us through what essentially is the entire labeling process in one diagram that I created. So, how does labeling produce more deviance? This is probably the best visual summary of the theory that I could create for this, so I'm just going to try to walk you through the process from beginning to end. And if we start here with primary deviance, so remember I touched upon this with Lemert's work. This is the initial rule violation. Labeling theory doesn't necessarily claim to explain why that behavior occurred. Then we have social reaction, and that can involve more formal and informal labeling, which we'll distinguish more carefully on the next slide. But once the label is applied, essentially, an individual, they might experience stigma and differential treatment due to that label. And that can include things like rejection, discrimination, exclusion, or simply being treated differently because of their newly recognized status and label. And then we reach what I think is one of the more important parts of contemporary labeling theory, identity and social change. So the consequences of the label can start to affect your life in several different dimensions. A person's self-concept can change, their peer relationships might change, their conventional social ties might weaken, and we can also start to see things like blocked opportunities. Education becomes more difficult for you. Employment opportunities are also going to become more restricted if you have a label of a felon. Conventional social integration is also going to become harder to maintain. And so when we see these processes here, the individual might become more likely to engage in secondary deviance. And so notice something extremely important here. We're not claiming that there's some sort of magical causal property contained in the word criminal. The mechanism is that social consequences attached to that label, and that's what makes the process potentially criminogenic. And that also shows why modern labeling theory is broader than a theory of identity, because the label can affect not only how you see yourself, but also how other people see you, and in turn, who you associate with, and what opportunities might remain available to you. And so all these pathways can definitely contribute to a person's continuing offending. With this said, there is an important qualification that we're going to address later in the lecture. This process is not inevitable. So not every person who is receiving a criminal label is going to progress through every single box that I have on this slide here. Some people will resist the label. Some people will still maintain some sort of strong conventional relationships. Some people will still have opportunities that protect them from these consequences, even after being labeled. So that's why the contemporary labeling theory is best understood probabilistically rather than deterministically. So with this said, even so, as a theoretical model, this diagram definitely captures the central causal argument here, that social reactions can alter a person's identities, relationships, and opportunities in ways that will increase the probability of secondary deviance. So I did touch upon this earlier, but labeling theory does distinguish between formal and informal labeling. So I'm going to start off with formal labeling. Formal labels are imposed through institutions of social control. So think about things like the police, the courts, correctional institutions. These are all powerful forms of labeling because the individual's deviant or criminal status does become officially recognized. And this formal status can potentially follow somebody well beyond the original deviance, the original misconduct. And we will see this later on when I discuss Pager's work on criminal records and employment, but labeling doesn't require a courtroom or an arrest because we do have things like informal labeling, where informal labels emerge through everyday social relationships. Parents might begin to view a child as a troublemaker. Teachers might begin expecting misconduct from a certain student. Peers might treat somebody differently. Employers or community members might come to see somebody primarily through a deviant identity. And so these labels can communicate a very powerful message, and the distinction becomes something like you did something deviant versus you are a deviant person. And like I mentioned earlier, that's definitely an important distinction here. So when the deviance becomes understood as a characteristic of the person rather than simply a behavior, then the label has the potential to become far more consequential as a result, and this does connect directly back into Cooley's work. If our self-concepts develop partly through how we believe others perceive and evaluate us, then repeated formal and informal interactions are going to eventually influence the way in which an individual understands themselves. So this also connects back to Becker because labels are being socially applied, and it connects to Lemert because these reactions might contribute to the transition from primary toward secondary deviance. So notice how the historical pieces are now starting to come together. We have Cooley giving us the social construction of self, Tannenbaum giving us the dramatization of deviance, Lemert distinguishing primary from secondary deviance, and lastly Becker emphasizing societal reaction and the application of the rules and labels. And contemporary labeling theory asks how these reactions subsequently affect things like stigma, social networks, identity, and other life opportunities. So that's more of the theoretical foundation that we need before we start looking into empirical evidence. So now that we understand the overall labeling process, let's isolate one of the more important mechanisms, identity transformation. So this is going to take us directly back to Lemert's concept of secondary deviance, and if you look at the progression on the slide here, we're going to start off with primary deviance. So I did something deviant. Then we have the repeated labeling and social reaction. The person becomes increasingly aware that other people perceive them as deviant, so other people are seeing me as deviant. That's going to be a lot of what they're thinking. And then that's the transition that labeling theorists are more so interested in. The person starts to believe that being deviant is becoming a part of who they are. And so an important point is that there's a difference between engaging in a deviant act and then developing a deviant identity. So someone can violate a rule without organizing their identity around that behavior. And that's essentially the distinction that Lemert is making with primary deviance. But repeated social reactions can make deviant status increasingly salient. So other people will begin treating the individual through that status. Expectations can change, conventional identities can become more difficult to maintain, and eventually the person might just identify more with delinquency or deviance. And Restivio and Lanier's work is particularly useful here because their research actually examines self-identification with delinquency as one of the mechanisms that actually connects formal intervention and subsequent deviant behaviors. So their findings indicate that formal labeling was associated with increased self-identification with delinquency, which in turn was associated with later delinquent behaviors. So that's definitely important empirical evidence that I wanted to include because we're no longer simply assuming that identity transformation happens. Researchers are actually attempting to measure intermediate mechanisms. So you have the formal intervention, the deviant self-concept, and then subsequent deviant acts. So I now want to emphasize something that we're going to return to a little bit later on. Labeling theory is not deterministic. I said that in the other slide. But just once again, I mean, being arrested doesn't automatically make somebody internalize a criminal identity. Being called a delinquent doesn't necessarily guarantee secondary deviance. So instead, labeling theory proposes that these social reactions can actually just increase the probability of identity transformation under particular conditions. So the central takeaway from this slide is pretty straightforward. Punishment and social reaction potentially change not only what someone does, but how they understand who they are. But like I've said before, identity transformation doesn't occur in a vacuum, and labels also affect how other people treat us, and that's where the stigma becomes important. So now we need to consider how a deviant label might become self-fulfilling. So suppose someone acquires the label of a criminal, and that label communicates information to other people. Employers might perceive that person as untrustworthy, conventional peers might distance themselves, and the community members, as a result of you being labeled as a criminal, they're going to probably expect future misconduct from you. So the label therefore produces expectations of rejection, devaluation, and discrimination. And these expectations can actually generate real social consequences, including things like exclusion, weakened conventional opportunities, and altered social relationships. So this is where the self-fulfilling prophecy becomes very important. A person initially receives a label because of previous behavior, but the stigma attached to that label can create social conditions that make subsequent deviance more likely, as we've talked about. So an intervention that's intended to say, do not engage in this behavior again, might simultaneously make conventional behaviors more difficult. So this leads us to Better Call Saul. I think this is just a useful illustration, and I really just wanted to talk about the series, I'm not going to lie. But with this said, I mean, the character of Jimmy McGill, Slippin' Jimmy, is a personification of this stigma and self-fulfilling prophecy. So he attempts to construct a conventional identity as a legitimate attorney throughout the series. But Jimmy's older brother, Chuck McGill, continues to interpret Jimmy through his old deviant identity. So Jimmy's older brother, Chuck, I don't like Chuck, by the way, but Chuck is essentially continuing to interpret Jimmy through his old deviant identity, because Jimmy was like a scam artist. He used to, be just an untrustworthy con artist who would be misusing the law. And so Chuck is continuing to interpret Jimmy through his old deviant identity. And so he's attached this label to Jimmy of, you're still Slippin' Jimmy. And the label here, consequently becomes something more like Jimmy's master status. And so rather than evaluating Jimmy according to his current efforts of working hard to become a lawyer and become a, admirable, hardworking member of society, Chuck is really interpreting nearly everything that Jimmy does through his history of deviance. And so his expectations also produce tangible consequences, because Jimmy is therefore denied respect. He doesn't get the job at HHM. He's, doesn't have any legitimacy. He's having a hard time getting any real legitimate work. He's laughed at all the time. I mean, he has, no access to real conventional professional opportunities, even after he passed the bar. So over time, throughout the series of Better Call Saul, Jimmy comes to expect that people like Chuck and the institutions such as HHM and the legal profession, they're never going to completely accept him. And so this rejection, this stigma, it doesn't single-handedly create Saul Goodman, the character that, the name change that Jimmy later becomes. If you watch the series, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But this does weaken Jimmy's attachment to a conventional identity. And so he increasingly internalizes and performs his identity of Saul Goodman, Slippin' Jimmy, that others have assigned to him, ultimately embracing Saul Goodman as his more openly deviant persona in the series. So if we were to look at this from labeling theory terms, Jimmy's earlier scams can be understood as primary deviance, and the stigma and exclusion attached to Slippin' Jimmy label then helped create the conditions conducive enough for him to engage in that secondary deviance. So the continued rule breaking that becomes increasingly connected to his identity and way of life throughout the series. And so we have other research from Lincoln colleagues that similarly emphasize that stigma doesn't require a person to experience direct rejection every day, but people do develop expectations of rejection. And if you believe that employers, conventional peers, or other community members are going to devalue you just because of your status and your deviant label, then those expectations can definitely shape behavior for social interactions. So labeling theory is not the label equals the inevitable criminal career. The more defensible argument is label equals potential stigma and social consequences, weakened conventional opportunities and identities, and an increased probability of more secondary deviance. So Jimmy doesn't become Saul Goodman simply because Chuck calls him Slippin' Jimmy. Rather, it's Chuck's continuing judgment that helps create a social environment in which Jimmy's effort to become a legitimate and hardworking member of society is just repeatedly undermined time and time again. And so as a a result, Jimmy embraces a more deviant identity to become more increasingly attractive, right? So this is the paradox here. I mean, you have a social reaction that's intended to identify or discourage deviance. It actually creates barriers that make the continued deviance more likely. So Lincoln colleagues developed this stigma process, and more explicitly through modified labeling theory, which we're going to be examining next. So moving into modified labeling theory. Modified labeling theory gives us a more precise account of how stigma becomes consequential. So Link's original work actually concerned mental health labeling and not criminal offending, so we should use this mechanism without trying to misrepresent the original context here. But the process does begin with cultural beliefs, and people learn about stereotypes and stigmatized groups before a label even applies to them. And once a person acquires that status, those beliefs become personally relevant. So the individual now expects devaluation or just rejection, and they might respond through secrecy, withdrawal, or social distancing. And the key insight is that direct rejection is not required every day, and anticipated rejection can shape itself by shaping behavior, relationships, employment, income, and social functioning. So applying this cautiously to criminal justice, the model would suggest that cultural stigma, the label, is going to become personally relevant, and then you're going to have some sort of anticipated rejection, coping responses, and social consequences. So this does move us beyond the vague claim that labels simply hurt feelings, and it identifies a mechanism through which the shared beliefs about a stigmatized status can alter behaviors and opportunities. And identity and stigma are only part of the story here overall, just a piece of the puzzle. So official intervention can also change a person's social network, which leads us to criminal embeddedness. So this refers to increasing integration into networks where delinquency or offending are common, and before intervention, an individual might be connected to schools, families, employment, and conventional peers. But things like arrest, court processing, or juvenile intervention can actually weaken these ties while increasing contact with delinquent peers or other just groups of criminals. So the mechanism doesn't necessarily require someone to internalize a criminal identity. Even if the person thinks, I am a criminal, well, intervention can still change who surrounds them. And labeling theory therefore asks a very specific causal question: can criminal justice intervention itself restructure social relationships in a criminogenic direction? So research by Bernburg Krohn and other colleagues, Restivio and Lanier, do support this pathway, and they tested, and in the work of Bernburg, Krohn, and Rivera, they actually directly tested whether or not official intervention changes peer networks and subsequent delinquency. Okay, so to give a little research spotlight to Bernburg, Krohn, and Rivera, they actually conducted a longitudinal test of official labeling, criminal embeddedness, and subsequent delinquency. Rather than asking only whether labeled youths offended more later, they actually tested why that relationship might occur, and so official juvenile justice intervention was associated with greater gang membership and delinquent peer associations. So that's pretty interesting, because these were then associated with more subsequent serious delinquency. And so together, these peer mechanisms accounted for approximately 46% of the effect of intervention on later serious delinquency. And so this statistic doesn't mean that labeling caused 46% of an individual's offending, but it does mean that within the relationship studied here, gang membership and delinquent peers did mediate a substantial portion of the intervention effect. So the theoretical pathway, according to their research, would be boom, you got the official intervention. And then you have more criminal embeddedness. You're hanging out with other criminals. And then there's subsequent serious delinquency as a result, right? So the study is therefore showing that labeling might affect not only how people see themselves, but also whom they're surrounded by. So labeling theory also asks whether or not official intervention can alter a person's life trajectory, and the consequences of arrest, conviction, and incarceration might continue after the formal sanction ends by just disrupting things like a person's education, employment, and other conventional bonds that they have, their relationships. And so these disadvantages can accumulate, and if you have educational disruption, that's obviously going to reduce employment prospects, and restricted employment can weaken conventional job opportunities. So these are losses that are very likely going to increase the probability of a person's continued offending, and this is a cumulative disadvantage. So classic labeling theory emphasizes the formal label, the identity transformation, and then secondary deviance, and contemporary research here is just adding the formal label is also associated with more restricted opportunities, which accumulate in disadvantage, and then you have an increased risk of continued offending. So identity does remain important, but with this said, the labels might also operate by changing the objective structure of opportunities across a person's life course. Okay, so getting into a research spotlight, Bernburg and Krohn in 2003 examined labeling life chances in adult crime, and the question here wasn't merely whether officially intervened adolescents offended more later, but whether intervention damaged conventional opportunities that then influenced offending. So, official intervention during adolescence was associated with diminished educational and employment opportunities, and these diminished life chances in turn were connected to greater criminal involvement in early adulthood. So, their analysis identified both direct and indirect effects of intervention. And the pathway is adolescence intervention, diminished conventional life chances, greater adult criminal involvement. So this broadens labeling theory beyond psychological internalization. Intervention can disrupt things, like I've said, education, restricting employment, and this allows disadvantages to accumulate even when the individual rejects a criminal identity. So the question becomes not only what do people call me, but also what opportunities remain available after I've been officially labeled. So cumulative disadvantage means that one disadvantage generates another and the effect starts to build over time. So an official label might disrupt education, educational loss might create employment barriers, and reduced employment might further weaken conventional opportunities and increase the risk of continued offending. So the contemporary pathway is primary deviance, official intervention, damaged life chances, and cumulative disadvantage, which results in more subsequent offending. So these all complement one another, and Lemert's identity-based account here, according to him, a person might reject the label and still encounter its objective consequences. So simply saying I'm not a criminal doesn't remove barriers to education or employment that are still created by the official involvement. So cumulative disadvantage is therefore showing us how labeling can operate through both the self-concept and the social structures. So this was just another interesting research spotlight by Lopes that I wanted to include here. This was a longitudinal test of formal police intervention during adolescence and later outcomes in emerging adulthood. So the whole central question here was whether or not an intervention would alter the life chances that would help explain subsequent offending. So formal intervention in this case was associated with lower educational attainment and poor employment outcomes. So they actually reduced life chances, and they were associated with a greater subsequent criminal involvement. So the proposed pathway was police intervene, reduced life chances, cumulative disadvantage, and continued crime. And together with Bernburg and Krohn, the study by Lopes here is really supporting the idea that formal intervention can shape conventional opportunity structures beyond the immediate sanction. So, you have causal caution, and that remains necessary because people receiving interventions might already differ from those who don't. Still, longitudinal designs improve upon simple cross-sectional associations by examining change over time. So I wanted to dive into Pager's 2003 Mark of a Criminal Record because it demonstrates how an official label can follow someone into the labor market. So using an audit design, Pager compared otherwise similar applicants while varying whether or not they were presented with a criminal record. So the applicants with criminal records were substantially less likely to receive employer callbacks. And Pager also found racially unequal effects, which was showing that a criminal record can compound upon existing labor market disadvantages. So the study directly demonstrates employer discrimination that associated with criminal record signals, and it doesn't by itself establish that the entire chain from the criminal record to unemployment to subsequent crime, but this broader interpretation would require evidence from larger labeling and cumulative disadvantage literature, but Pager does provide concrete evidence that a criminal record can remain socially consequential after punishment ends. So once again, the label is still changing institutional responses and restricting legitimate employment. So with all of this said, we need to still go over, does labeling theory actually work? The most accurate answer is yes, but conditionally so. So research does link official intervention with later offending and does identify several different mechanisms. So Bernburg, Krohn, and Rivera do support criminal embeddedness through gang membership and delinquent peers. And Lopes and colleagues were also able to connect intervention to disrupted things like education, employment, and life chances. And as I was able to mention with Pager's work, they showed that criminal records do reduce employer callbacks, and Lincoln colleagues explained how stigmatized statuses can actually generate anticipated rejection for people. So all of this literature that I've talked about today, When we take all this together, the evidence does suggest that intervention can reshape peer networks, opportunities, institutional treatment, and expectations of rejection. So this is a little bit more sophisticated than simply just stating, hey, labeled people tend to offend more. However, secondary deviance is not inevitable. People will vary whether or not they internalize labels, or if they decide to lose conventional ties, enter criminal networks, or experience lasting disadvantage. So the better question is under what conditions and through which mechanisms and for whom labeling effects are the strongest. If labeling effects aren't universal, then what determines when a label becomes consequential? So that brings us to when labeling theory matters the most, and contemporary labeling theory treats labeling as probabilistic, not deterministic. I've said that a couple times. And a label changes the probability of an outcome rather than mechanically determining a person's future. So several conditions shape this effect. And several conditions shape its effects. Strong family, school employment, and peer bonds, they're going to buffer stigma, whereas the loss of these ties are very likely to intensify it. Prior criminal involvement also matters because people enter intervention with different risks and histories, so social environments differ in whether they preserve conventional networks or increase exposure to delinquent peers. And the form and intensity of intervention, such as arrest and conviction, incarceration, are also going to produce different consequences. So with all this said, individuals do have agency. And we have qualitative research by Abra that shows that labels alone, they don't explain criminal persistence, and personal motivation and changes in a social environment could facilitate desistance. So if we're going to look at this, you wouldn't go out and say, hey, once you're labeled, you're doomed. That's it, it's over. Instead, we should be saying that labels can create pressures and consequences that would increase secondary deviance under particular conditions, while people are also able to resist these labels. And with these qualifications established, now we can actually assess the overall principal strengths of labeling theory. Labeling theory's first strength would be parsimony. Its core proposition, social reactions to deviance can influence subsequent deviance, is pretty simple, and yet it generates testable hypotheses about identity, stigma, peer networks, education, employment, and cumulative disadvantage. So that's pretty good. And second, labeling theory redirects criminology toward the social control process. So police, courts, schools, and different correctional institutions are not merely just neutral responders. Their reactions become objects of explanation toward crime. And third, it does explain unintended consequences of control. So interventions that are intended to reduce crime can also stigmatize individuals, thus weakening conventional opportunities or increasing criminal embeddedness. So contemporary research makes all of these different mechanisms very testable. Like I've said with the different studies today of Link examining stigma, Bernburg and colleagues examining different peer networks, Bernburg Krohn and Rivera examining life chances, Pager examining employment, and Lopes and colleagues examining cumulative disadvantage. So lastly, I would just say that the theory has clear policy relevance that is very much testable because it asks when formal intervention is necessary and what collateral consequences it does create. So these contributions are definitely substantial, but I would say, admittedly, labeling theory does have many important limitations worth noting. So getting into some of its weaknesses, I would say its clearest limitation is that it doesn't strongly explain the initial deviance. I've said that a couple times throughout today's lecture. It is principally a theory of how social reaction might amplify or sustain behavior after the primary deviance has occurred. A second problem is the causal selection. So if officially sanctioned youths offend more later, we have to ask, did the intervention actually increase offending, or were the higher risk youths simply more likely to be sanctioned? And longitudinal research does help, but the causal inference problem still remains. Third, people do possess agency and might resist labels, and they can persevere beyond, conventional relationships and desist from committing crime. Also, the mechanisms of labeling theory can be a little bit difficult to separate. Identity change, stigma, peer network change, family disruption, and employment loss, while they all matter simultaneously, it does complicate attempts to just estimate each pathway's individual individual effect when we look at all of them together. So an overly simple theory would therefore just overpredict secondary deviance. And, the defensible proposition is not that punishment creates criminals, but that under certain conditions, social reactions can also alter identities, relationships, and opportunities in a way that increase the probability of continued deviance. Okay, so now diving into the policy implications. So, labeling theory doesn't imply that society should stop responding to crime altogether. Instead, it recommends limiting unnecessary formal intervention and stigmatization when these responses damage the conventional relationships and opportunities that promote desistance. So, first, diversion and deinstitutionalization might be appropriate for lower-level offending, and they can preserve accountability without unnecessarily deepening just the formal labeling and disrupting these pro-social ties that a lot of people have. So, or even just increasing exposure to delinquent peers. And this is all in the vein of what a labeling theorist would, try to push for a policy perspective, not my own beliefs. Second, I think labeling theory, policy would really try to reduce the lasting power of criminal labels after punishment. So again, you're slapped with the label of a convicted felon. Well, research on your life chances and the cumulative disadvantage and employment shows clear barriers after this. Third, interventions should definitely preserve family ties, education, employment, and pro-social networks. And lastly, policy should distinguish between condemning behavior from permanently condemning the person. Pushing reintegration would be of paramount importance. It's okay to say, hey, what you did was unacceptable and goes against our standards of society, but change for you still remains possible, right? So more of guidance here. And the principle would be to reduce unnecessary stigmatization and not accountability itself. So still holding people accountable, but just reducing that stigmatization that's associated with a lot of these labels. And these policy implications return us to the central labeling paradox. So the labeling paradox is that an intervention intended to control crime might, under certain conditions, create criminogenic consequences. So the intended pathway is pretty straightforward, as I've built out for you here on the screen. Crime leads to punishment, punishment leads to deterrence or rehabilitation, and then you have less crime. So labeling theory identifies an alternative pathway where you have the primary deviance, formal intervention, stigma, identity change, criminal embeddedness, and restricted opportunities, cumulative disadvantage, and the increased probability of secondary deviance. So intervention might actually affect how people see themselves, whom they associate with, and what opportunities remain available to them. Also, of course, how institutions treat them. Now, social control is therefore not necessarily outside of this causal process. It does become a part of it. The pathway, this is not inevitable, and people, like I've mentioned many times, they can resist labels, they can maintain conventional bonds, and they can desist from committing crime even after their first initial deviance. So, because intervention can have criminogenic consequences, these risks must be considered in criminal justice policy. So the central lesson here is that social control is not always neutral. It can become a part of a causal process that it was intended to prevent. And now we conclude with the 5 essential takeaways. So if you can remember 5 points, remember these. First, labeling theory primarily explains secondary rather than primary deviance. Its distinctive question is what happens after society reacts to an initial rule violation. Second, deviance is partly constructed through social reaction, and Becker reminds us that groups create and reinforce rules, and they identify violators, and then they apply the rules. Third, labels operate through multiple mechanisms: identity, transformation, stigma, and anticipated rejection, criminal embeddedness, blocked conventional opportunities, and cumulative disadvantage. Fourth, meaningful empirical evidence supports these pathways. Like I've said many times before, the studies with Link, Bernburg and colleagues, Bernburg Krohn, Rivera, Lopes, Pager, etc. Fifth, labeling is probabilistic. There is no destiny here once you're slapped with the label. You're not completely screwed from the get-go. With this said, social reactions, yes, they can alter your identity, your relationships, and opportunities in meaningful ways that will increase the probability of continued deviance, but they don't mechanically determine anybody's future. So with all this said, labeling theory is important. I mean, it definitely changed criminology by asking not only just why people deviate, but it really started to put a magnifying glass over society's response and pulling back the fine veneer on how society actually shapes what happens to somebody next. And once society reacts, the reaction in turn of society can obviously produce consequences of its own, and that's of paramount importance and what I would implore you to remember walking away from this lecture. But with all this said, I appreciate your time and patience. I conclude today's lecture, and hope you all take care.